I am excited to continue our series where we were last weekend. We're picking up again this weekend. And I want to ask you a question as we dive in and get going this morning. How is your endurance? In the hard things of life, and the difficult things of life, and the things that you have to really work at. How do you do in those situations, in those moments? And no, I'm not preaching about marriage today. Some of you have already gone. I'm not talking about marriage. I'm not talking about parenting this morning either. I know that's one of those things. I'm not talking about the pandemic this morning. But we are talking about endurance for a few minutes because this is a huge part of what God is teaching Moses as he walks through this book that we're reading in the book of Exodus. But just process that in the difficult moments of life, in the difficult situations and environments of life. How is your endurance right now? How well do you persist? How resilient are you in the hard things of life? I want to show you a picture of a guy that I have never met, but this guy is from France. And I Googled the pronunciation of his name because I actually took 1 year of French in middle school, and I don't think I learned anything at all, right? I eventually switched out of there and did Spanish and don't know much of that. But this guy's name is Francois. Francois Din is the way that I heard it on Google. That may not be French at all, but that's what Google said, so I believe it, all right? So he's a guy that is into endurance running. I look at that and I say, what is wrong with you, man? You know, I don't know why you would ever do that. But he was actually in our state just a month ago. So in the month of July, Francois was here to run something called the Hard Rock 100. Have any of you guys ever heard of the Hard Rock 100? Okay, a few of you have. So I have a picture to show you a little bit of what it looks like. This is kind of the terrain. And what they do is they literally run 100.5 miles through the mountains. Non-stop. I mean, if you look at the website, it tells you that they're going up and down, but they have an elevation gain of about 33,000 feet during their 100 miles that they're running, and then it comes down 33,000 feet, so it's up and down kind of thing. And so on July 16th, Friday morning, 6:01 in the morning, they started running this Hard Rock 100, and ran for almost 24 hours straight at 3:45 a.m. on Saturday morning. Francois crossed the finish line first, won the race at 21 hours and 45 minutes. And like I said, I look at that and I think, he has lost his mind, along with the 100 or so other people that were competing, right? Why in the world would you ever do that? When I was a kid and playing sports myself, one of the things that our coaches did is if you got in trouble, if you did something wrong, if you got out of line or whatever, you ended up having to run endurance kind of stuff. It was a punishment, It wasn't something to look forward to. And for whatever reason, these kind of people, and I'm saying these kind of people like there are none of us in here, I think you can look at me and tell I'm not an endurance runner, right? But these people have decided that they just enjoy punishing themselves, and they run and they run and they run and they don't stop. They go all over the world competing in these incredible long distance runs. Now, you may never come to a place where you run 100 miles. I don't think I will run 100 miles total in my entire life, right? You may never be a long distance endurance kind of runner. But I can almost guarantee you, you're going to have moments in life, I'm going to have moments in life where endurance is going to make all of the difference, where resilience and persistence is going to determine if you cross the finish line or not. And it may be in a marriage. It may be in parenting. It may be in a pandemic. It could be in a job. It could be in almost any situation in life. Every single one of us are going to come to a place where if we do not endure, we will not cross the finish line. That's part of the lesson that God is going to be teaching Moses today as we continue walking through the book of Exodus. So if you were with us last weekend, you may remember we started this series that we're just calling Give Me 40. And in this series, what we're doing is we are walking through the book of Exodus, not verse by verse, but we are actually reading one chapter a day through the book of Exodus. And so after we've read 7 chapters during the week, we come in here, we talk about something from those 7 chapters. If you are just jumping in with us, this past week we read chapters 8 through 14, so you're not very far behind. And what we've been looking at is we've been looking at the idea that the book of Exodus is a book that helps us understand how God became king in Israel. So he goes and he rescues them. He pulls them out of slavery, right? He gives them a new place to head toward, a new home to live in. And as he takes them from one place of slavery to this new home and freedom, he gives them all of these laws where he's saying, if you want to live in my kingdom and experience life the way that I want you to experience it, you need to have these new disciplines in the way that you do life. So for 6 weeks, as we read through the book of Exodus, we're looking at 6 disciplines that God has called us to in order to experience his reign and rule in our lives, in order to experience his kingdom in our worlds. Last weekend, we looked at the discipline of surrender, and we basically said that's where our journey with God always starts, is this place of surrender. Today, we're going to press forward, and if you read with us this week, you may remember that pretty much everything that we read was all about plagues and hardship and difficulty, right? It's this season of Exodus where God has said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And Pharaoh doesn't let the people go, and God sends a plague, and Pharaoh still doesn't let them go, and go through this incredible cycle 10 times, right? So that's what we were reading this week, and in order to see in more depth the one discipline that I think God wants us to take away this week, I want us to look at Exodus chapter 10. That's where we're going to hang out for a few minutes this morning, Exodus chapter 10, and we'll just start in verse 1. It says this, then the Lord said to Moses, return to Pharaoh and make your demands again. If you just read that, it's like, okay, yeah, that's obviously what happens in the story. We know that. Return, demand it again, and Pharaoh's not going to do it, right? But think about what's going on here for just a second. This is not the first time that God has said, go to Pharaoh, right? That's why he says, return and do it again, right? He has told him to do this a number of times already. In fact, God has, if you were here last weekend with us, you remember the whole burning bush thing? And in the burning bush, God said, go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. Go to the land that you are a fugitive from, that you ran from because you murdered somebody there. Yeah, that's part of Moses' story, right? He says, go back to that place, to the very person who is probably the most powerful man in the known world at that time, and confront him, saying, let my people go. So as you proceed, you start to see Moses doing that. He goes one time, and he says, God says, let my people go. If you don't believe God sent me, he says, here's this stick that God told me to pick up on the road. And he throws it down, and it turns into a serpent. You remember that, right? And Pharaoh says, yeah, that's nothing. My guys can do that as well. His magicians can do the same thing. And he says, no, I'm not letting them go. In fact, I'm going to make life harder on these people because of what you were doing. You're just trying to get out of work, is all he says. So he says to Moses, God says to Moses 7 times before this, go back, do it again. Go back, try it one more time, right? 7 times. Let me just ask you a quick question. How well do you do with following through when you're frustrated? How well do you do at things of carrying them to completion when it is not working the way that it's supposed to work? Maybe it's this situation where you're a parent and you bought your kids a play set for Christmas, and it's Christmas Eve, and you've got to put it together. Maybe some of you dads have been here, or moms have been here, and you've waited to the last second, so you're outside, and it's getting dark on Christmas Eve, or is dark, and you've got the flashlight, and you're trying to read the Chinese instructions, and you start to put it together, and you get almost to the end, and it's like, where do these 18 pieces go? I don't know how I missed these somewhere. Okay, tear it back down, start over again. And you start over again, and you just aren't getting it. I mean, how many times do you keep trying? How many times do you keep trying? Or do you just say, forget it, I will work on it, and we'll do it as a family tomorrow on Christmas Day, Or you've got to bake a cake for something that has to be presented. And you bake it, and you bring it out of the oven, and as you bring it out of the oven, the whole center just collapses in, right? And you're like, this isn't good. This is no longer presentable to the world around me. And so you go to look to start over, and you don't have enough eggs now, or you don't have one of the ingredients. And how many times do you keep doing it? How persistent are you before you finally just say, look, forget it, right? Or you've been trying to teach your child a lesson. And you've been trying to teach them this lesson for the last 6 months, and you keep telling them, and and they keep doing the opposite, to the point where you're finally like, okay, do what you want to do. I'm out of this, right? I mean, where is that point for you? Where is that moment where you start to say, I'm done, I'm walking away, I'm not going to be a part of this? For Moses, he's been to Pharaoh 7 times. And God tells him, keep going back, right? And at some point, Moses looks up and he's like, God, we tried this. Let's do something else, After 1 time of Pharaoh saying, no, I'm not letting him go. After 2 times, no. You would think Moses would be like, forget it. This has been fun, God. You deal with him. I can't be a part of this because this guy's driving me crazy. You would think he would hit this point where it's just like, I'm not doing this any longer. And so from the very beginning of the story, I just want you to see that this is not just a good story that you learned as a child in Sunday school and you've heard, let my people. This is Moses having to go back over and over and over and over, even when he doesn't want to, right? Going on in that verse, it says this, I, God speaking, I have made him and his officials stubborn, so I can display my miraculous signs among them. If you've read this before, or if you're reading it in a different version, your version may not say, I've made them stubborn. It may say, I have made his heart hard. I have hardened his heart, and they won't do what they're supposed to do. I don't know if you've ever met anyone who is stubborn. But maybe you have. Maybe they live in the house with you. Maybe they are a friend of yours. Maybe they are your pastor standing on this stage. I don't know if you've ever met anybody stubborn, but this is an important distinction that's happening here where God is saying, this guy Pharaoh, he is incredibly stubborn. And if it's not his way, he's not going to do it. If it's not his idea, he's not going to carry it out. He is stubborn to the nth degree. But I also, if I'm honest, I look at passages like this, and it causes a little bit of frustration because it's like, okay, it's saying that I, God, have made him and his officials stubborn. I have hardened his heart. What do you do with that? What do you do with a God who hardens his heart and then says, I'm going to punish you for what you've done? That doesn't seem right, does it? That's not fair. I mean, who wants to worship a God that says, I'm going to cause you to act in a certain way, and then I'm going to punish you for the way that you acted? What do you do with that? I think it's really important to stop for just a second and pay attention to this because it matters in terms of what we're going to see in the outcome here in just a second. So I don't know if you've ever wrestled with this before, but this is one of those passages, one of those places where so many people get to this point in Exodus and they say, I don't know how to go on because I don't know how to worship a God who hardens somebody's heart and then he punishes them for what he did. But just like every scenario, let me remind you, you always have to pay attention to context. You can't just pull this verse out and say, okay, God makes people's hearts hard, he makes them stubborn, and then he punishes them, and that's who God is. Because if you do that, you have misunderstood the story. If you do that, you have misunderstood the character of God. In fact, let me just walk you through really quickly. We're gonna do this really quickly, but let me just walk you through the sequence of events that leads to this statement, okay? If you go all the way back to the passage that we looked at last week, you may remember, again, the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3, that's where God and Moses are hanging out. And as God speaks to Moses out of the burning bush, he says something to him to give him forewarning. So Exodus chapter 3, let's see, I think it's verse 19. Yeah, he says this, God speaking, he says, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand forces him. So before any of this occurs, God says, you know what? I'm not bound by time and space. I know what's coming. I know he is not going to give you the opportunity to go. I know that. I have foreknowledge about what is coming. And then you jump forward into where some of these plagues start happening. If you jump forward to Exodus chapter 7, you start seeing the plagues. Exodus 7, verse 12, I believe it is. Yeah, verse 13. I'm sorry. It says this. So Aaron and Moses come and they throw down the staff and you know, Pharaoh doesn't believe. It says this, Pharaoh's heart, however, remained hard. This is the first time. He still refused to listen, just as the Lord had predicted. If you look at that literally in the Hebrew, it says that his heart hardened. It doesn't say it was hard or it became hard. It just says his heart hardened, and it doesn't say who did the hardening. But if you go through the rest of the first five plagues, do you know what happens in the first 5 plagues? Every single time, the implication is, or it says it directly, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Every time, first 5 plagues, he has an opportunity to follow God. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Eventually, you get to plague 6 through 10, and you can get to this place where we looked at just a second ago. But 6 through 10, 4 out of the 5 times, it says that God hardened his heart. You know what I think is happening here? Pharaoh had every opportunity. God didn't force him into a predestined situation where that's all he could do. Pharaoh had every opportunity to do the right thing. His heart was hard, and he continued to harden his heart until eventually God, when we get to the place that we're at now, God says this. He says, okay, if that's your choice, if that's where you're going to go, I'm just going to help you go down that path, and I'm still going to get the glory for it. And so eventually you come to this place where it's saying God participated in hardening his heart after Pharaoh had chosen that over and over and over and over again. And so you get to this place where Moses and Pharaoh are interacting, and Pharaoh has made his choice, and God says, if that's your choice, then that's where I'm going to let you go. That's where we're going to continue to move. So I think it's really important to see that here, because what's happening is Pharaoh is becoming stubborn, and he's enduring in that. Does that make sense? He is enduring, he is persisting, he is being resilient in his stubbornness. And God says, if that's what you want to do, this is not going to go well. And as Pharaoh is doing that, Moses is seeing the opposite, where Pharaoh is enduring in stubbornness. Moses is enduring in obedience. And he keeps going back, even though that's not his desire. He keeps going back because God says, you just keep going back and keep speaking to Pharaoh. So we're going to move quickly through the last part of this, but in verse 2 of chapter 10, it goes on and says, I've also done it so that you can tell your children and grandchildren how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and about the signs I displayed among them, so that you will know that I am the Lord. Verse 3, so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. And I love this, again, connecting back to last week. Remember what the first discipline is? Surrender, surrender, surrender. And this is what God says to Pharaoh. He says, how long will you refuse to submit to me? In other words, Pharaoh is not starting the journey yet, right? He has not surrendered yet. How long will you refuse to submit to me? Let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse, watch out, for tomorrow I will bring a swarm of locusts on your country. They will cover the land so that you won't be able to see the ground. They will devour what little is left of your crops after the hailstorm, including all the trees growing in the fields. They will overrun your palaces and the homes of your officials and all the houses in Egypt. Never in the history of Egypt have your ancestors seen a plague like this one. And Moses turned and left Pharaoh. That's the end of the conversation, right? Pharaoh is, again, being stubborn in the way that he is resisting God. And so Moses says, if that's the path you're going to go down, here's the next thing that's going to happen. There are all of these locusts that are going to devour your fields. They've just had this massive hailstorm, by the way. There aren't many crops left. And he says, you are risking the lives of the entire Egyptian nation by your stubbornness, by your unwillingness to listen to the voice of God. You are risking the entire Egyptian world. In verse 7, the officials who are with Pharaoh basically say the same thing. They say this. It says, Pharaoh's officials now came to Pharaoh and appealed to him. How long will you let this man hold us hostage, right? It's this endurance thing. And the officials are saying, how long are you going to endure in your stubbornness? How long are you going to hold on to your ways? And the last part of that verse says, let the men go to worship the Lord their God. Don't you realize that Egypt lies in ruins? There's this contrasting picture that's happening here, and I think it's so important, right? It's this picture where, first of all, it shows us that endurance in terms of stubbornness will deeply cost everyone around you. But on the other side, this picture of Moses shows that endurance in terms of obedience opens our world up to the power and presence of God. It's only as Moses keeps going back and keeps going into this situation that we start to see the power of God unfold in these incredible plagues that happen. Let me just remind you of something really quickly. Because we tend to take people like Moses and we put them up on this pedestal and we say, wow, we want to be like that guy, right? But let me just remind you of something. Moses didn't do anything spectacular in any of these events. Moses didn't cause hail to come. Moses didn't cause darkness to come over the land. Moses didn't bring in the locusts. You know what Moses did? He just showed up and did what God said. Every time. He just kept coming back. He kept enduring in obedience. And as he endured in obedience, the power of God was seen through his faithfulness. It's such a huge, huge lesson for us. Yeah, there's a book, a children's book that was written a long time ago that maybe you remember, are familiar with. It was a book about going on a bear hunt. Anybody remember going on a bear hunt? Right? So if you remember the story is we're going on a bear hunt, gonna catch a big one, got our binoculars, we're not scared, right? And as they go, they keep encountering these different obstacles. So first of all, they encounter this incredibly tall grass, and they see this grass, and you probably remember the refrain. They say, oh, we can't go over it, can't go under it, guess we have to go through it, right? And they finally get through the grass and they come to the river, and the river is there in front of them, and they're trying to get past, and they say, oh, we can't go over it, can't go under it. Guess we'll have to swim through it. And they come to this big dark forest, and they say, we can't go over it, can't go under it, can't go around it. I guess we'll have to go through it. And although there is nothing theological about that book at all, I think it's exactly the same lesson that God is trying to teach us through Moses, where he is saying there are going to be moments in your life, and maybe it's related to your marriage, maybe it's related to parenting, maybe it's related to your job, maybe it's related to school, and it is not going to be easy. But here's the incredible news from God. He says, here's what I want you to know. Even though we can't go over it, even though we can't go under it, even though we can't skirt around this, I'm going through it with you. And as we go through this together, you are going to learn what it means for me to be king of your world and your life. That's the entire message of this section, guys, is saying through Moses to us, saying, look, if you want to have God as your king, if you want to know God as your ruler, if you want him to be the leader of your life, it's not that everything in life is going to be easy. It's not that everything is just going to fall in line the way that you want it to fall in line, but God will go through it with you, and if you are willing to learn the discipline of endurance, it will change the way you relate to him. Endurance and enduring in obedience opens our worlds to the power and the presence of the living God. Father, as we process this, as we hang on to this, we're thankful for guys like Moses. We look at it, and to some degree, it looks like he went through this 100-mile run just so he could be obedient to you. It's so easy for us to fall away, Father. It's so easy for us to say, this is hard, I don't want to do it anymore. It's so easy for us to get frustrated. But I pray that as we endure in obedience, that we would experience you in powerful, tangible ways. I pray that we would come to know you as the king and the ruler of our lives and our worlds. Help us to be people who are resilient, who are persistent, and who endure. We pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen.